This is my homemade Spiderman mask. Here's how I made it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start back at the beginning with the face shell. Now, you might be wondering what a face shell is, but basically, it's the core of this entirely homemade mask, and it keeps it in the exact face shape needed. It is the building point for the rest of the mask, so I'll start with these paper patterns here. If you want to build this project, you can find these exact patterns in the description, along with all the other materials I used. I'll trace these parts onto a piece of cardboard, then carefully cut them out with my X-Acto knife. I made sure to take my time with these pieces because they'll be very important later. With these 3 panels cut, I can start assembling. After each side gets attached onto the middle piece with a good amount of hot glue, the core of this helmet is finished. I'll set this aside for a moment and begin on the main build. Although it may seem complicated, these patterns fit together to make the entirety of the face shell. But first, I'll transfer these onto some poster board, then cut them out using scissors and my knife. Then once I've mirrored each piece for the other side, I can start putting this thing together. I used a mix of hot glue and super glue to hold the face shell together, along with some blue tape on the outside to keep it nice and strong while it dries. I started with gluing all the darts together on each of the pieces, then I took the 3 finished sub-assemblies and glued them all together into one. Once the glue was all dry, I took off the tape and was left with a pretty good looking half of the face shell. So I repeated these steps for the other side and then attached them together along the middle seam. Now, at this point, the construction of the face shell is finished, but it's very flimsy, and that's not good. So I lightly glued the face shell onto the inner supports that I set aside earlier. Much better, and now it's starting to take shape. Next, I moved on to the lenses, and for that, I used some binder board, which is basically a very dense cardboard. I cut out my pattern 4 times, then layered each lens twice to make the frames a bit thicker. A few drops of super glue holds them in place, and once I'm happy with their shape, I curve them with my fingers to fit the contour of the face. At this point, everything is still very flimsy, which is not ideal at all. So to strengthen the face shell and to make it nice and sturdy, I'm gonna coat it with some tabletop epoxy resin. I poured equal amounts of part A and part B and then mixed them together for a few minutes and applied a few even coats over the whole piece with a sponge brush. After that was done, I taped on the lenses and carefully resined them in place, making sure to avoid accidentally connecting them. Once they were dry, I was able to remove them. It's time to reinforce the inside, but first I need to get rid of some of the supports. With those out of the way, we can apply some fiberglass cloth on the inside. Once it's saturated with resin and has time to cure, it makes the face shell incredibly strong, so the rest of the supports can be removed. Because I only slightly glued this in earlier, it came out really easy. Finally, I'm able to try on the face shell, and it fits. If it didn't, I'd have to start all over, but luckily, I can move on to sanding the piece down with some low grit sandpaper. I noticed that it's pretty challenging to breathe in the face shell, so I'm going to drill a bunch of ventilation holes in it. Looking at this project, I wasn't too happy with the shape of the nose, so I added a little extra bit of cardboard to give the nose more of a point. Now that I was happy with the shape, I used some wood filler to smooth out the face shell. This stuff can be applied very easily with your finger and smoothened out with water. After it has had at least a few hours to dry, I can sand it down with a bit of 220 grit to get a nice smooth finish. After thoroughly wiping off the dust, the last step for the face shell is to spray it with some primer. Okay, time to start on the actual mask. I found some cheap stretchy red fabric that will work great for this project. To achieve that signature pattern on the Sam Raimi mask, I thought that using some netting could work. Here you can see that it matches pretty well. To get the pattern to show up, I sprayed a mix of reds and oranges on top. Although it's not perfect, I think it emulates that look well enough. I actually didn't make the fabric pattern for this project. Instead, I used Bryan Alzate's templates and scaled the pages to 110%, then cut the borders off and taped them together. Next, I took my red fabric and put it above the template on a window. The light from behind it allows me to trace all the lines onto the fabric with some chalk. With all those lines transferred, I carefully began to cut out the fabric, making sure to leave enough space to sew the edge. I also transferred my edge line onto the inside. Coming back to that pattern, I cut out all the blank space to leave me with just the webbing lines. This will then be traced onto a very odd material, a large rubber sheet. It's pretty stiff at first, but when cut thin enough, the rubber provides a decent stretch. Since this is a pretty unusual material, you can find a link to this one in the description. Once I had the webbing lines transferred over, I could finally get rid of the paper to reveal some of those beautifully traced webs. Then began the very, very tedious process of cutting out every last gap in the design. Cutting out the rubber took a lot of strength, so it tired me out quickly. Because of this, it took me several days to finally finish, but once I was done, I was extremely happy with the result. However, I think that the rubber I got was slightly too thick, so I'd recommend getting something that's a bit thinner. Anyways, the top edge of the rubber has to be a shiny silver, so to achieve this look, I used a chrome silver Sharpie paint pen. Initially here I used some silver paint, but that ended up chipping almost immediately, so I definitely stick with the paint pen. Once that's all painted, I can get a glimpse of what this mask is going to look like. Okay, back to the mask. After I folded this piece in half to align the back seam together, it's time to crack out the sewing machine. I sewed the fabric in a zigzag stitch in order to make the seam nice and stretchy. Some safety pins were also super helpful in order to keep everything in place. With all the sewing done, I can finally slip the mask over the face shell, and it looks not great. However, we can fix this by gluing the fabric to the face shell in small increments with super glue. For me, the simplest starting point was gluing the fabric right at the middle of the nose. With that part locked on, I could stretch the fabric across the face shell to get it nice and smooth. I also took the time to cut out and then glue the eye holes in place. I'm not gonna lie, this took a lot of time to finish and was really frustrating, but I was eventually able to get everything attached. This mask is really starting to take shape. Now that the fabric was applied, I began to glue on the webbing. I started at the bridge of the nose again and worked my way out from there, stretching and pulling as needed. At every intersection of the webbing, I made sure to glue it on with lots of pressure. After I had the front mostly glued on, there was a bit of excess around the eyes, so I also trimmed that off as well. This step I found easiest to do with some sharp scissors. Once I had everything mostly glued on, the neck area required a bit of trimming. Since I didn't want to use a zipper on this project, and a hem is not possible here because the fabric must stretch, I just cut all the excess off. At this point I can finally try on the mask, and I immediately noticed that the back was bunching up a lot, which is really ugly. To fix this, I strategically removed small segments of the webbing and glued the ends together. If you look closely, it's definitely noticeable, but from a distance, the webbing looks a whole lot better. There's only one thing left to finish up on this project: the lenses. I started by sanding down the wood filler I applied across each piece with some medium grit sandpaper. Once they were fairly smooth, a quick layer of filler primer made them even smoother. Then I sprayed the lenses with a few coats of dark steel from Rust-Oleum. While these dried, I began on the actual lenses. These started with a curvy piece of plastic that came from some respirator packaging. Once I had them cut down to the right size, I painted a metallic blue-purple on the inside edge to somewhat replicate that look seen in the movie. This was then followed up by painting a lot of small dots across the top surface. Moving on to the mesh on the inside of the lenses, I decided to use some white tulle. It's a very thin fabric, but with a few extra layers added, I can get a fairly nice look. Now comes the problem of keeping all these tulle layers in place. To solve that, I stacked up 6 layers on some parchment paper, then put a bead of hot glue all the way around the edge, and finally applied some force on top to permanently press it all together. With a bit of a trim, these mesh inserts get hit with a bit more silver paint in order to give them a metallic shine. These 3 layers I've created can finally come together to make a completed lens. After a quick test fit, I glued all the parts together to finish both lenses. I am extremely happy with how these came out, especially with how simple the materials that compose them are. I realized that some of the red underneath the lenses might be visible, so a bit of black paint applied around the edge could solve this issue. After that has had time to dry, the lenses get a quick test fit. Once I'm happy with their position, I can slowly and carefully super glue them in place to finish the mask. That's it, we're done. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. You can check the description for all the materials I use in this project, and feel free to leave some suggestions for what you want to see me build next.